A playground divided. Alicia Brooks gripped the rusted chains of the swing tightly, her small fingers curling around the cool metal as she gently rocked back and forth. The afternoon sun bathed the playground in golden light, casting long shadows over the grassy field. Laughter filled the air. Children ran, jumped, and played without a care in the world. But Alicia wasn't one of them. She watched from a distance, her dark brown eyes following the familiar figure of Michael, the boy who used to be her best friend. His joyful laughter rang out as he played a game of tag with a group of kids. Just a few weeks ago, they had been inseparable, chasing each other around the playground, inventing secret handshakes, and sharing their favorite snacks. But now, he barely even looked at her. Her stomach twisted with a feeling she didn't fully understand yet. It wasn't just sadness. It was something deeper, something heavy and cold that sat in her chest like a rock. She knew the reason things had changed. Susan, Michael's mother. Alicia had always been polite to her, always offering a bright hello whenever she saw her at the park. But Susan never smiled back. She barely even acknowledged her presence. It wasn't until recently that Alicia had begun to notice the way Susan's lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line whenever she saw her son playing with Alicia. Then, one day, it happened. Alicia had run up to Michael, excited to show him the new jump rope tricks she had learned. But before she could even say a word, Susan had appeared between them like a storm cloud blocking out the sun. "Michael," she had said sharply, grabbing her son's wrist, "I told you not to play with her." Michael had looked confused at first, then embarrassed, his cheeks flushing red as he glanced at Alicia before quickly looking away. "But, Mom." "No buts." Susan's voice was firm, her gaze cold as ice. "I don't want to see you playing with her again. Do you understand me?" Alicia had stood there frozen, her hands gripping the handle of her jump rope, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't understand. What had she done wrong? Michael had lowered his head, his shoulders slumping. "Yes, Mom." And just like that, everything had changed. Now, sitting on the swing alone, Alicia could still feel the sting of that moment. She had tried to talk to Michael after that day, but he had only given her short, awkward replies before hurrying off. The other kids had followed his lead, as if she had suddenly become invisible, or worse, untouchable. A shadow fell over her, and Alicia looked up just in time to see Susan striding toward her. The woman's blonde hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and she wore a crisp white blouse and designer jeans, looking completely out of place in a playground filled with running, dirt-covered children. Alicia's stomach tightened. "Get up," Susan said coldly. Alicia blinked. What?" "I said, get up," Susan repeated, her voice sharp like a blade. "I don't want you here." Alicia's fingers curled around the swing chains. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Susan's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "You don't belong here." Alicia felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something, to ask why Susan hated her so much, but the words wouldn't come out. The woman sighed impatiently and suddenly reached forward, grabbing Alicia's arm roughly. "Did you hear me, girl?" Susan hissed. "I said leave." Pain shot through Alicia's arm, but before she could react, Susan shoved her off the swing. Alicia stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the sandpit. She hit the ground hard, scraping her elbow against the rough gravel. Gasps filled the air. Alicia's eyes welled with tears as she looked up at Susan, who stood over her with a satisfied smirk. "Now run along," the woman sneered. "Find somewhere else to pollute." Alicia's lower lip trembled, but she refused to let herself cry in front of this woman. She scrambled to her feet, dusting off her scraped elbow. The playground had gone eerily silent, and she could feel dozens of eyes watching her. Some of the kids looked uncomfortable, while others simply avoided looking at her at all. Michael was staring at the ground, his fists clenched at his sides. Alicia wanted him to say something, to stand up for her. But he didn't. With her head held high, Alicia turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. But just as she reached the edge of the playground, a deep, commanding voice cut through the silence like thunder. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Alicia froze. Susan's face twisted in surprise as she turned to face the man who had spoken. Alicia turned too, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing at the entrance of the playground, was her father. James Brooks was not a man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. He was tall, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the ground. His deep brown skin was smooth, his jawline sharp, and his dark eyes burned with quiet fury. He was dressed in his usual tailored suit, the kind he always wore to work, and his presence alone seemed to command the attention of everyone in the park. Susan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. James stepped forward, his gaze locked onto Susan. "I ask you a question," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you think you're doing putting your hands on my daughter?" The playground was silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. Alicia's heart pounded. She had never seen her father look this angry before. Susan, for the first time, looked uncertain. But then, as if remembering herself, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin defiantly. "I was simply removing an unwelcome presence," she said, her voice laced with forced confidence. "Your daughter." "My daughter," James interrupted, his voice cutting through her words like a blade, "was minding her own business. You, on the other hand, just assaulted a child." A flicker of panic crossed Susan's face, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. "Oh, please, you're overreacting." James took another step forward, his expression unreadable. "Am I?" he asked. Susan crossed her arms. "This is a public playground. I have every right to." "You have no right," James snapped, his voice like steel. "No right to put your hands on my child. No right to tell her where she belongs." The intensity in his gaze made Susan take a step back. Alicia felt a lump form in her throat. She had never seen her father this furious before, but she also felt something else. Something warm, like a shield wrapping around her. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. The playground remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Then, James did something that made Susan's face drain of all color. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held it up. "You just assaulted my daughter in front of half this playground," he said coolly, "and I'm willing to bet that at least one of these parents caught it on video." Susan's breath hitched. "And considering who I am," James continued, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The color drained from Susan's face completely. Alicia had no idea what her father meant, but she knew one thing for certain. Susan was about to learn a truth she never expected, and she was going to regret every second of it. The truth that shook the playground. The playground remained silent, tension thick in the air. All eyes were fixed on the confrontation between Susan Carter and James Brooks. Parents who had previously watched in quiet complicity now seemed uneasy, shifting in place, pretending to check their phones, or glancing nervously at each other. Even the children, usually oblivious to adult conflicts, had stopped playing, sensing the weight of the moment. Susan, usually so smug and full of herself, now stood stiffly, her face pale. She had never imagined that slapping a little black girl out of her playground would result in something like this. She had always believed she was untouchable, protected by her status, her circle, and the silent approval of people like her. But James Brooks wasn't someone she could dismiss. He held up his phone, his finger hovering over the screen. "Say that again," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Tell me how you have the right to put your hands on my child." Susan's lips parted, but no words came out. James took a step closer, his towering frame making her visibly flinch. He wasn't touching her, but his presence alone made her take another step back. "What's the matter?" he continued, his voice steady. "You were so confident a moment ago. Go ahead. Say it." Susan's jaw clenched, and she crossed her arms. "I don't have to explain myself to you." James chuckled, but it was devoid of amusement. "Oh, you will. Because right now, you're standing in the middle of a public park after physically assaulting a 10-year-old girl. And trust me." His eyes darkened. "You do not want to find out who I am in a courtroom." The murmur among the onlookers grew louder. Parents exchanged whispers. A few of them had pulled out their phones, recording the entire confrontation. Susan's bravado faltered as she realized that she wasn't just facing down an angry father. She was being watched, scrutinized, and documented. Alicia stood beside her father, still shaken but standing tall. The sting from the slap on her cheek lingered, but it was nothing compared to the warmth she felt knowing her father was here, standing up for her. Then, a familiar voice cut through the tense air. "Dad?" Alicia turned sharply, and so did everyone else. Michael stood at the edge of the crowd, his blue eyes wide, confusion written all over his young face. Susan paled even further. James arched an eyebrow. "Dad?" The crowd went completely still. Alicia's mouth went dry. Had she heard that right? Had Michael just called her father Dad? Michael looked back and forth between James and Susan, his expression desperate and conflicted. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking. "Why is he here?" Susan took a deep breath, as if trying to collect herself, but her eyes darted around wildly, as though looking for an escape. "Michael, go home. Now." "No." Michael's voice was firm, though his hands were shaking. "Not until you tell me the truth." James crossed his arms, studying the boy carefully. Then his gaze flicked back to Susan, who was now trembling. "Do you want to tell him?" "Susan." Susan took a step back. "This isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's exactly the time," James said smoothly. "You see, I have a little rule in life. When a person puts their hands on my child, they owe me an explanation. And you." His eyes bore into her. "You owe us all a very big explanation." The crowd shifted. They had come expecting drama, but no one had anticipated this. Alicia looked at Michael, who was still staring at her father with a look of dawning realization. And then, like a dam breaking, the truth came spilling out. "I should have known," James murmured. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable bite in his tone. "You never changed, did you, Susan?" Susan's nostrils flared. "You have no right to talk to me like that." "No right." James laughed humorlessly. "I was going to leave this in the hands of the law, but now I see the bigger picture." He turned to Alicia, his eyes softening for a moment before he looked at Michael. "Your mother never told you about me, did she?" Michael shook his head. "No, I don't even know what's happening." James exhaled, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I'll make it simple." He turned to Susan. "You didn't want your son playing with Alicia because of her skin color. You told him to stay away from her. You physically assaulted my daughter because of your hatred." His eyes darkened. "But you didn't realize who she was." Susan said nothing. James continued. "She's your son's sister." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Michael staggered backward, his face draining of all color. "What?" His voice cracked. "No, that can't be true." Alicia's breath hitched. She looked at her father in shock. "Dad." James nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, sweetheart." Then he turned back to Susan. "You lied to him, didn't you?" James said, his voice low but powerful. "You told him I abandoned you. That I wanted nothing to do with him." Michael's breathing became rapid. "Mom, is that true?" Susan clenched her fists. "I did what was best for you." "No, you did what was best for you," James corrected. "You hid the truth because you didn't want the world to know that you had a black man's child." Michael looked between his mother and James, his body trembling. He took a step toward his father hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're my dad." James' expression softened as he nodded. "Yes, Michael." Tears welled up in Michael's eyes. I I thought my dad didn't want me." James inhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's not true. I never abandoned you. I never even got the chance to know you." His voice turned steely as he looked at Susan, because she made sure of it. Susan grabbed Michael's arm. "That's enough. We're leaving." But Michael yanked his arm away. "No." His voice was stronger now. "You lied to me, Mom." He turned to James. "Is it true? Did you want to know me?" James knelt so he was at eye level with the boy. "More than anything," he said sincerely. "I looked for you. I searched for years. But your mother made sure I couldn't find you." A tear slid down Michael's cheek. Susan was breathing heavily now, her body tense. "You don't understand, Michael. No," Michael interrupted, his voice firm. "You don't understand. You took my dad away from me. You made me hate my own sister." His voice cracked, his pain evident. "And I don't even know her." Alicia's heart squeezed in her chest. Susan's mask of confidence finally shattered. And for the first time in her life, she realized she had lost. A broken lie, a shattered family. The playground, once filled with the carefree laughter of children, had transformed into a courtroom of silent judgment. Parents and children alike stood frozen, witnessing the collapse of a carefully guarded lie. Susan Carter's perfect world, built on deception and prejudice, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Michael, his chest rising and falling rapidly, stood in the space between his mother and his father. Two opposing forces, two conflicting truths, and yet both were his parents. His whole life, he had been told one story: that his father had abandoned him, that he wasn't worth loving, that his mother had raised him alone because she had no choice. But now, standing before him, was the man he had been told never cared. And yet, this man looked at him like he was the most important thing in the world. James Brooks, the father he never knew, was right there. And he had just learned that the girl he had been forced to hate, Alicia, was his sister. The weight of it all made Michael feel like the ground beneath him was breaking apart. His mother had lied. Susan Carter, for the first time in her life, looked genuinely afraid, not of James, but of the truth finally catching up to her. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling, "this isn't the place to talk about this. Let's go home." But Michael didn't move. He stood there, his body stiff, his hands clenched into tight fists. He was shaking, and Alicia could see the war raging inside him. The war between the boy who had trusted his mother and the boy who was just now realizing that trust had been misplaced. "You lied to me," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Susan's face twisted. "Michael, I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Michael's voice cracked. He took a shaky step back. "From my dad. From my sister." His breath hitched. "Do you know how messed up that is?" Susan's lips parted, but for the first time, she didn't have an answer. James, who had been watching the exchange closely, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "I don't know what your mother told you about me, Michael," he said, kneeling so that he was eye level with his son. "But I need you to know the truth. I never left you. I never abandoned you. I spent years looking for you." His jaw clenched as he glanced at Susan. "But she made sure I couldn't find you." Michael turned to his mother sharply. "Is that true?" Susan took a deep breath. "I did what I thought was right at the time." Michael shook his head, tears forming in his eyes. No, that's not an answer." His voice wavered. "Did you keep my dad away from me? Did you lie?" Susan was silent, and that silence was louder than any confession. Michael's face crumpled. His shoulders began to shake. "You made me believe my dad never wanted me," he whispered. "You made me believe I was nothing to him." His voice cracked with pain. "Do you know how that feels?" Susan reached out for him, but he stepped back. "Michael, please." No," he shouted, his voice raw. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to pretend you were protecting me. Alicia, who had been standing quietly beside her father, felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her was still reeling from the revelation. Michael was her brother, the same boy who had once been her best friend, who had laughed with her, played with her, and then, one day, turned his back on her because of their mother's hate. And yet, looking at him now, Alicia didn't see an enemy. She saw a boy who had just had his entire world turned upside down. Taking a deep breath, she took a step forward. Michael turned to her, his blue eyes filled with pain and shame. "Alicia," he swallowed hard. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." Alicia studied him, searching his face for the boy she once knew. "I believe you," she finally said. Michael's breath shuddered, and he wiped his face quickly, ashamed of the tears slipping down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. Alicia nodded, her voice soft but steady. "I know." Michael turned back to his mother. His face was streaked with tears, but there was something else in his expression now, something cold. "I don't want to go home with you," he said quietly. Susan's eyes widened. "Michael, I don't trust you," he cut her off, his voice trembling. "You made me hate my own family." His voice broke on the last word. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Susan's breath came out in a shudder. She looked around, as if searching for someone to take her side. But the onlookers who had once been passive were now looking at her with something close to disgust. For years, Susan had thrived in her carefully built world, where she controlled the narrative, where she decided who was acceptable and who wasn't. But today, that world was gone. She had lost, and she knew it. James took a step forward and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Michael, I know this is a lot," he said gently, "but you're not alone." Michael looked up at him, his eyes still filled with pain. "What happens now?" James looked at Susan. "That depends," he said. His tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Are you going to do the right thing, Susan? Or are you going to keep running?" Susan clenched her jaw, her entire body rigid. But in the end, she knew there was only one way out of this. She had no power here. Not anymore. With a shuddering breath, she stepped back. "Fine," she murmured. "If you want to go with him, go." Michael's breath hitched. And just like that, the life he had always known was over. Alicia reached for his hand hesitantly. And this time, for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael didn't pull away. James exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxing as he wrapped an arm around both of his children. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." As they walked away, the playground remained silent, and Susan Carter was left standing alone, watching as the family she had tried so hard to tear apart walked away without her. The weight of consequences. Michael sat stiffly in the back seat of his father's sleek black car, staring out the window at the blurred streets passing by. The world outside seemed to be moving too fast, yet he felt stuck, frozen in the whirlwind of everything he had just discovered. His father, his sister, his mother's lies. Michael clenched his hands into fists, his mind replaying the events at the playground over and over again. He had thought his mother was his protector, the one person who always had his best interests at heart. But now he wasn't sure what was real anymore. Alicia sat beside him, quiet but alert, occasionally glancing at him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. She wasn't sure how to act around him. A few hours ago, he had been nothing more than a classmate who had abandoned her. Now, he was her brother. And James Brooks, the father who had been missing from both their lives, sat in the driver's seat, focused on the road but occasionally checking the rearview mirror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James spoke. "You hungry?" The question startled Michael out of his thoughts. He turned his head slightly, unsure how to respond. I guess," he muttered. James nodded. "There's a diner up ahead. We'll stop there." Alicia didn't say anything, but she relaxed slightly. She wasn't sure how her father was staying so calm after everything that had just happened, but she was grateful for it. A few minutes later, They pulled into the parking lot of a small, cozy-looking diner. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting a soft red glow over the pavement. Michael hesitated before stepping out of the car, but James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Come on, son." The word son sent a strange, unfamiliar feeling through Michael's chest. He had always wanted to hear it, but not like this. Not after finding out the truth in such a brutal way. They entered the diner, where the smell of coffee and grilled food filled the air. A waitress greeted them with a warm smile and led them to a booth by the window. James picked up the menu but barely glanced at it. "Get whatever you want, both of you," he said. Alicia nodded and opened her menu, but Michael barely looked at his. He was still stuck in his own head. His mother had always warned him to stay away from people like Alicia, had told him that they were different, that they didn't belong together. But now, here he was, sitting in a booth with her, realizing that she was part of him in a way he had never imagined. Alicia hesitated before breaking the silence. "So, she cleared her throat. "What's your favorite food?" Michael blinked at the random question. I don't know." Alicia shrugged. "I just thought, we don't really know each other. And well, that's kinda weird, right?" Michael shifted in his seat. "I guess." He glanced at the menu. "I like pancakes." Alicia grinned. "Same." Michael looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw himself in her. Not just in their shared father, but in the way she scrunched her nose when she smiled, the way she fidgeted when she was nervous. It hit him like a punch to the chest. This was his sister, and he had spent months avoiding her, ignoring her, hurting her, all because of his mother's hatred. The weight of it all became unbearable. Michael put his menu down and lowered his head. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "I don't know how to make up for everything." Alicia tilted her head. "You don't have to fix it all at once," she said. "But maybe we can just start over." Michael hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." James, who had been watching the exchange silently, finally spoke. "Michael, I know this is a lot," he said gently, "and I don't expect you to process everything right away. But I need you to know something." Michael looked up. "I never abandoned you," James said firmly. "Not for a second. I wanted to be there. I wanted to know you. And I still do." Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. He had spent so many years believing that his father had walked away from him without a second thought, but now, hearing this man, his father, say the opposite, made something deep inside him crack. Michael exhaled shakily. "I want to know you too." James smiled. It wasn't a big celebratory smile. It was soft, understanding. "A promise. Then we'll figure it out," he said. The waitress returned, and they placed their orders. The rest of the meal was quieter but less tense. Michael and Alicia exchanged small talk, and James let them lead the conversation, only stepping in when necessary. For the first time, Michael felt like he wasn't lost. But as they finished their food, reality came crashing back. "What about Mom?" Michael asked suddenly. His voice was hesitant, unsure. James set his fork down, his expression unreadable. "That's up to you," he said. "I won't force you to do anything. But you need to ask yourself, can you trust her?" Michael's stomach twisted. He didn't know the answer to that. "She's still my mom," he muttered. "She raised me. She was all I had." James nodded. "And no one is telling you to forget that. But she also lied to you. She made choices that hurt you." Michael stared at his plate. He didn't want to lose his mother, but at the same time, he wasn't sure he could look at her the same way ever again. I need time," he admitted. James nodded. "Then take your time." Michael exhaled slowly. Alicia reached across the table and nudged his arm. "In the meantime," she said, grinning, "we have so much catching up to do." Michael managed a small smile. "Yeah, we do." For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had always thought. But he also knew that when he finally faced his mother again, it wouldn't be the same. And neither would he. A mother's reckoning. The days that followed felt surreal for Michael. He had gone from believing he had no father to realizing he had one who had been searching for him his entire life. He had gone from shunning Alicia to understanding that she was his sister. His world had flipped upside down, and no matter how much he tried to make sense of it, he couldn't. But there was still one thing he couldn't ignore: his mother. She had called him multiple times. At first, he ignored her. Then she started sending messages. Some were short and pleading. "Michael, please call me." Others were defensive, filled with anger. "I did what was best for you." Michael wasn't ready to respond. James had given him space, never pushing him to talk about his mother if he didn't want to. He and Alicia had welcomed Michael into their lives slowly, never forcing him to accept everything at once. They let him take the lead, and for that, he was grateful. But no matter how much he tried to push it aside, he knew he had to face her. So one afternoon, after pacing back and forth for an hour, he finally called her. The phone barely rang before she picked up. "Michael?" Her voice was rushed, panicked, as if she had been waiting for this call for days. Michael's throat tightened. "Yeah, it's me." A long pause. Then a shaky breath. "Baby, you have no idea how much I've missed you." Michael swallowed hard. "I'm not calling to make things easy for you, Mom. I need answers." Susan was silent for a moment, then sighed. "I know." Michael sat down on his bed, gripping his phone tightly. "Why?" His voice cracked slightly. "Why did you lie? Why did you tell me my dad didn't want me?" Susan hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Because I had to, Michael. You don't understand what it was like for me." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "Then make me understand." A deep breath. Then, finally, the words came. "I was scared," Susan admitted. "When I found out I was pregnant, your father and I were happy. We had plans to raise you together. But then, people started talking. My parents, my friends, they didn't approve of him. They told me that if I had a child with a black man, my life would be ruined." Michael's stomach twisted. "So you just left?" Tears filled Susan's voice. "I was young, Michael. I was weak. My parents pressured me, and I caved. I moved away without telling him, changed my number. I wanted to believe that if I disappeared, it would be easier for everyone." Michael felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "For you, you mean?" "Yes," Susan whispered. "For me." Michael's mind reeled. She had made a decision for both of them, one that had robbed him of a father, of a family. And then what? You just decided to make him the bad guy. Susan's breath hitched. "It was easier that way. If I told you he left, if I told you he didn't care, then you wouldn't have to wonder about him. You wouldn't have to feel the pain of knowing he wanted you, but I took that away from you." Michael's vision blurred. "You didn't do it for me. You did it for yourself." A pause. Then a broken, "I know." Silence stretched between them. Michael rubbed his temples, his mind spinning. "And what about Alicia? Why did you hate her so much?" Susan let out a bitter laugh. "Because she was proof. Every time I saw her, I saw him, and I couldn't handle it. So I told myself that they weren't like us, that they didn't belong." Michael let out a sharp breath. "Do you even hear yourself? You made me hate my own sister because of your own guilt." Susan sobbed. "I know, Michael. I know I messed up." Michael shook his head. He didn't even know if there was anything left to say. "I don't know how to forgive you," he whispered. Susan's breath hitched. "I don't expect you to. I just want my son back." Michael closed his eyes. "I don't know if that's possible," he admitted. A choked sob came from the other end. "Please, just let me see you. Just once." Michael hesitated. Then finally, he said, "I'll think about it." And he hung up. That night, Michael sat at the dining table with James and Alicia. It was a quiet dinner, filled with the clinking of forks against plates. But James, ever perceptive, finally asked, "Did you talk to her?" Michael nodded. "Yeah." Alicia lowered her fork, and Michael let out a shaky breath. "She told me everything." James didn't push. He just nodded. "And how do you feel?" Michael hesitated. Then he said, "I don't know." Alicia reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "That's okay." Michael looked at her, the girl he had once abandoned, the girl he had once turned his back on. His sister. And for the first time, he realized that even though he had lost one version of his life, he had gained something new. He wasn't alone. James gave him a knowing look. "Take your time, son. We're not going anywhere." Michael swallowed hard, nodding. And for the first time in his life, he believed that. The road to healing. The days that followed Michael's phone call with his mother were a blur of emotions. He felt like he was being pulled in different directions, toward his past, his future, his pain, and his hope. He had spent so long believing one thing, only to find out that his entire life had been built on a lie. And now he had a choice to make. Did he let his mother back in? Did he forgive her? Could he? James and Alicia never pressured him. They gave him space to process, to feel, to figure things out on his own terms. He appreciated that. It was so different from the world he had grown up in, where his mother had dictated everything, who he could talk to, what he could believe, and who he was allowed to love. Now he had to decide for himself, and that terrified him. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch of his father's house, staring at the quiet neighborhood, Alicia joined him. She plopped down beside him, tucking her legs beneath her. "You look like you're thinking way too hard." Michael let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, I guess I am." Alicia nudged him lightly. "About Mom?" Michael nodded. "I just don't know what to do. She's my mom. No matter how much she lied, no matter how much she hurt me, she's still the person who raised me." Alicia sighed, leaning back against the porch railing. "I get it." Michael turned to her. "You do?" Alicia shrugged. "Yeah. Look, I never had a mom in my life the way you did, so I can't completely understand. But I do know what it feels like to have someone disappoint you, to want so badly for someone to be different, and realizing they're not." Michael swallowed hard. "So what do I do?" Alicia exhaled slowly. "That's up to you." Michael let out a humorless laugh. "That's the part that sucks." Alicia smiled slightly. "Welcome to growing up." Michael smirked, shaking his head. "You sound way too wise for a 10-year-old. "I read a lot of books," she said dramatically. Michael chuckled, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. But deep down, he knew what he had to do. And so, later that evening, he made a decision. The next morning, Michael stood in front of his mother's house, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come alone. He had told James and Alicia that this was something he needed to do by himself. Now, standing here, staring at the front door that had once felt like home, he wasn't so sure. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. There was a long pause before the door opened. Susan Carter looked different. She wasn't the perfectly put-together woman from the playground. She looked smaller, her eyes tired, her face pale. She had been crying. He could see the evidence in the puffiness around her eyes. "Michael," her voice cracked. Michael swallowed. "Hey, Mom." A beat of silence. Then Susan stepped aside. "Come in." Michael hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. Everything looked the same, yet it felt different. The walls, the furniture, the family photos, none of it felt like his anymore. They sat in the living room, an awkward, suffocating silence settling between them. Susan was the first to speak. "I didn't think you'd come." Michael stared at his hands. "I wasn't sure if I would." She nodded slowly. "But you did." "Yeah," he said quietly. Another silence. Susan let out a shaky breath. I know you probably hate me. I don't hate you, Michael interrupted. His voice was steady but firm. I'm angry. I'm hurt. But I don't hate you. Susan blinked rapidly, her lips trembling. I deserve that. Michael clenched his jaw. Why did you do it? Susan inhaled sharply. I was selfish. Her voice wavered. I was scared of what people would say, scared of what it would mean for my life, my reputation, my place in this world. A tear slid down her cheek. But I never thought about you, what it would do to you. Michael exhaled shakily. No, you didn't. Susan sobbed quietly, covering her face with her hands. I ruined everything. Michael looked away. Yeah. A long pause. Then Susan lowered her hands, her expression raw with emotion. Is there any way you can forgive me? Michael sat still, his heart hammering in his chest. Could he? He thought about James, about how his father had never given up on finding him, about Alicia, who had every right to hate him, but instead chose to accept him, about the life he was just starting to build. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily. It wouldn't be instant. But maybe, just maybe. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know if I'll ever trust you the same way again. Susan's breath hitched, but she nodded. Michael met her eyes. But I'm willing to try. A sob of relief burst from Susan's lips, and she reached for his hands. This time, Michael didn't pull away. That night, Michael returned to James' house. Alicia and James were waiting for him, their expressions unreadable. Michael stood in the doorway, exhaling deeply. I talked to her, he said. James nodded, waiting. Michael hesitated, then said, I don't think things will ever be the same. Alicia reached out, squeezing his arm gently. That's okay. Michael glanced at James. But I think I'd want to give her a chance. James studied him for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. That's your choice, son, and I'll support you. Michael felt his chest tighten at the word son. It was still new, still unfamiliar, but it was his now. His family was his now. He wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he had control over it. And that was enough.